So it's welcome. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph Coyle, who is the outgoing editor of JAMA Psychiatry, as well as having been the chair of Consolidated Department of Psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. It's a great pleasure to have you and to agree to speak to us. And I really want to thank you for the opportunity on behalf of the History and Archives Committee of the American Academy of Child Psychiatry, and the chair of that committee is Dr. David Klein, who, and Dr. Gross, co-chair, and I'm very privileged to be able to interview you today. On the occasion, I might add, of the Leon Eisenberg Award in 2015, which you will be receiving in a week's time. And next to you is Dr. Carola Eisenberg, the late Leon Eisenberg, the late great Leon Eisenberg's wife, as well as a leading figure at Harvard Medical School education and MIT education. Thank you. So on that introduction, I wanted to get started, Joe, to ask you a little bit about yourself. I know you were born in Chicago. Tell us a little bit about your interests in early education, interest in science, and how you selected where to go to study in college and so on.
Okay, so I was born and raised in the south side of Chicago. My father was a physician. In spite of his age, he volunteered in the Second World War and spent about 3 years in North Africa and in Italy. And I was conceived in New Orleans because I was born 9 months after he left, and that's where he left from, which may account for my predilection for oysters. But I had two sisters, and I was the youngest. Grew up in a sort of an Irish Catholic neighborhood in south side of Chicago, went to the local Catholic grade school, and then went to the Jesuit high school. And that was at a time when you really didn't ask questions. And so when I started, I was, among other things, taking Latin, and then they added Greek, and then they called me in at the middle of the freshman year and said, we're going to have to come an hour earlier now because you're going to do French. So it ended up that going through high school, I had 4 years of Greek, Latin, and French. And in terms of my interests in science, I, in retrospect, was a complete nerd. I wasn't particularly interested in baseball. I was mostly interested in spending time mucking around in a wetland that was behind our house, catching salamanders and snakes and observing nature. And I worked at a summer camp and was the nature counselor. So that's where my interest came from. I went to Holy Cross College, which was Jesuit college, which was the logical thing you do after you went to a Jesuit high school at that time. And I was a French and philosophy major and picked up my sciences largely in summer school. And in my junior year, I went and spent a year at the Sorbonne. So I also did another 4 years of Latin and 3 years of Greek, which I think was actually a very important part of my development because as a scientist, one of the most important products are the papers we write. And if we cannot write and communicate clearly, we cannot really accomplish what we want to do in terms of moving the field forward. So, and the other aspect of it is it gave me a whole part of my life that I think I would not have been involved in if I had done a straight scientific
Were you the only
career.
child, or you?
I had two older sisters.
Older sisters,
Yeah.
yeah. And so how did you then decide that you wanted to study medicine? And you didn't really take a year between, you just went direct, right? Or...
Right. Yeah, that was not a time for navel gazing. You graduated and you went on to some professional school or PhD. So what happened was, as I said, as a French and philosophy major in my junior year, a good friend of mine was working as a psychiatric orderly at the local community college, and he said it's really interesting. So why don't you do it? And so I did. I got a job, and a couple of weeks into my work there as a psychiatric orderly, in comes my best friend from grade school's brother with his first episode of schizophrenia. And it was, it just captured me. And it in a way, because of my interest in philosophy, it captured my attention as an epistemologic conundrum.
Right.
Jerry was having these delusions. Pretty soon I was wrapped up in these delusions, and I would say, Jerry, it doesn't make any sense, And so I became very interested in psychiatry, and there were a number of physicians in my family, and I was always kind of hedging my bet doing the requirements to get into medical school, and so my senior year, I decided that's what I was going to do. I was going to go to medical school and become a psychiatrist.
Right. So you had a very positive approach towards psychiatry, because during this period there was a lot of the anti-psychiatry type of writings, and like what is schizophrenia, does psychosis exist, and all these types of questions.
Yes. Well. In terms of what I do now, my motivation was obviously quite different. Neuroscience didn't exist. I was infatuated with Freud, Sartre, and Lacan.
Right.
Those were the motivating factors, and little did I know that Johns Hopkins was an oasis of empirical psychiatry and completely unfettered with psychoanalysis that dominated virtually every other academic department in the country.
Indeed.
So it was, like everything else, there's so much luck and chance involved that you don't recognize until you look at it with the...
So here we have like a young Darwinian wandering around in the wetlands, and then interested in philosophy and Sartre and Freud, and who now becomes a leading neuroscientist, goes to Johns Hopkins. So you had no difficulty getting into Hopkins then. You were a very good student at the Holy Cross, right? That must have been a very competitive medical school.
Yeah, it was certainly considered one of the top in the country. And, I applied to several, and I got this letter from Johns Hopkins, and my father was obviously very proud and pleased. And
what was your father's specialty?
He was an orthopedic surgeon.
Orthopedic surgeon. Did your mother also?
She was a nurse, and that's how they met.
So you come from a medical family.
Yeah, and her father was a small town physician in Iowa.
Okay.
My father's sister was married to a physician. My cousin was a physician. So there was a lot of medicine in the family.
It run in the family.
Yeah.
So there you go. Enter Hopkins in 1965 as a medical student. And we talked about it just a little bit, because I also know that between 65 and 67 is the magic years of Leon Eisenberg was there. So tell us a little bit about how you met Leon and first time, and what impressions that he made upon you.
He organized the introductory course in psychiatry for the first-year medical students. And back then, it was given the ideal time that we all loved, which was Saturday morning. So we had 5.5 days of education back then. And it was 2 hours on Saturday morning, followed by history of medicine. But I'd have to say it was an extraordinary experience. And I should point out that I think almost a dozen students, which was well over 10% in my class, went into psychiatry. It was, very empirically oriented. You had Seymour Ketty, you had Leon, Paul Wender, Jerome Frank, Stan Imber. Frank and Imber were doing quantitative, objective studies on how psychotherapy works. So the atmosphere was not against psychotherapy and psychological
Was Jerry
interventions.
Frank in that group too? Jerry Frank?
Yeah,
No.
Jerome Frank, yeah.
Oh, you
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah,
it. I'm sorry, I
Jerome Frank
didn't hear
and
you.
Stan Imber.
Yes, because he
yes.
started the group therapy.
Right, yes, and Jerome Frank and Persuasion and Healing. So it was the department was not in any way against psychological interventions. It just they wanted to approach it scientifically and figure out how it works.
Now, Seymour Ketty was the acting chair for a while, just before you came, and then
Right.
Elkis became the chair, right?
That is correct. I think Seymour was chair for a year, and he had the wisdom to see that this is not how one wants to spend their life.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and it stepped down. But of course, he was, he was asking questions that were 50 years ahead of his time on the genetics of schizophrenia, and carrying out these, these really difficult studies looking at adoptees where one of the parents was schizophrenic and they were adopted. Child was adopted in a family without schizophrenia.
The Danish adoption studies.
Cross fostering. Anyway, so Leon was leading the charge in all this and was the leader of the course. Another person involved was Bob Cook, who again this is a course in psychiatry, and if you look at Leon's publications on developmental aspects of psychiatry, developmental disabilities is an important theme there.
Right.
And
this is the early period of Leon's writings. Yeah.
Yes. Again, embracing aspects of brain illness that mainstream psychiatry would see as completely off the table because they were not amenable to psychoanalysis.
Well, he also saw that, like some of these conditions, like PKU, that like
Yes.
to be preventable conditions.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and
Right. And so Bob Cook, who was the chair of pediatrics, was also part of the course, and he had 2 children with Crete shot. And so, dealing with developmental disabilities was not just an academic issue for him; it was a very personal issue.
What a incredible period that you were in.
Yeah. it was exciting. I actually
tells us
enjoyed getting up and going to class on Saturday
The formative
morning.
years of medical school. And that by this time you already are really you're already thinking about schizophrenia before you even go to medical school, but
Right.
now you're beginning to think psychiatry very early then.
Right.
Yeah.
Although again, that kind of got me engaged in thinking about the brain as opposed to the mind. But what really turned things around for me or changed things for me was in my sophomore year taking the pharmacology course. They announced that they had a new instructor who was going to teach this new component of pharmacology called psychopharmacology. And it turned out to be Saul Snyder, who was at the same time a resident in psychiatry. And so he would come over with his whites on, and he would sit at the lecture table and he had a big, tall pitcher of clear liquid and a glass, and he would lecture and kind of slur his words, and everybody thought that maybe he had a pitcher of martinis there or something. But anyway, what he talked about was our beginning understanding of how drugs work in the brain, and it was a transformative experience, an epiphany. So I went and asked him if I could work in his laboratory.
Yeah.
And
This is like in his third year?
yeah, it's my third year.
Yeah.
And I was just dating my wife at that time, and I was there for about 6 weeks, and I said, I think I think I found out what I want to do with the rest of my life. This process of discovery is just, so exciting and personally satisfying. It's very different than what we used to think of science. Science was facts and it was boring, and you just had to do it and do those labs, which there was some sort of predictable outcome. But this was great. It was sort of like seeing if you could figure out how God designed the world, and so that made you a little closer.
Now, you published 3 peer-reviewed papers when you were still at medical school with Solomon Snyder.
Yeah.
Your first 3 papers, and he's a Lasker Award winner.
Yes.
And so was Seymour Ketty,
Yes.
probably the only, very few Lasker Award winners in psychiatry. By the time you finish medical school, you now are guided by some, because you do internship in pediatrics, which you mentioned was very prestigious. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you transitioned from there to the NIH?
Well, I had this. The long view was that I would do my training in pediatrics and in psychiatry and child psychiatry and go to NIH. In the end, my wife said, "Look, we got 3 kids, and you're in your psychiatric residency. Can we do this?" And so I ultimately did not do my training in child psychiatry. But my motivation, based on just knowing Leon and that developmental vision, I really felt the developmental aspects of the brain and its relationship to psychiatric disorders was the epicenter of what,
We are absolutely convinced of that.
Yes.
So we'll get back to that. The question, but there was this, so the reason why you chose the pediatric internship is because you really had that
right,
idea.
I wanted to do development, yes.
And also that it was a very prestigious internship at the medical school, right?
Well, I applied there and several other places.
Yeah.
My intent, I didn't actually expect to get in there because it was like the top.
Yeah. This is the Harriet Lane.
Yes, the Harriet Lane program was.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's debate, but it's right up there in the top 3 in the country. And ironically, because I was a French and philosophy major in college and had just the minimum amount of science, I really struggled academically for the first couple of years when we were doing the basic sciences. All my friends are out by the pool when the biochemistry course is going on, and I'm struggling to figure out how this stuff really works because they already took biochemistry. But anyway, so I didn't anticipate I would get accepted to the Harriet Lane program, and I was delighted to be accepted to the Harriet Lane program.
Well, I know you're being extremely humble, but that's so the question then is that you go into NIMH and you walk in 1969, 70. To Julius Axelrod's lab
Right.
at the Center for Scientific Study, Clinical Science. And well, tell us, how did that happen? How did you get into the Julius Axelrod lab?
Right.
And who introduced you to that and why? Because
right. So there were a couple of issues swirling around that. First of all, with regard to the Axelrod laboratory, Saul had done his postdoc with Julie, and so I had already had some interactions with Julie, and I would be kind of viewed as sort of a 3rd generation because Julie trained Saul, and I had a very good interview with Julie, and he was just perfectly delightful person. I interviewed with Floyd Bloom, Mimo Costa, and I
was that a common pattern for people training at the time, or whether at Johns Hopkins or to go to NIH? I mean, that must have been something pretty unique at that time.
Well, that's why I said historically there were events swirling on around us that really directed what we might want to do, and that was in the middle of Vietnam War. And if you got a slot at NIH, that satisfied your military
I see.
requirements. We called ourselves the Yellow Berets. And so talk about Darwinian. There was intense competition for these sites.
I see.
And there was just an article last week in Science pointing out that class of the mid '60s to the mid '70s that did NIH fellowships had extraordinary impact in terms of great science and winning awards. And that's because it was sort of the best of the best, not to be self-congratulatory, but it was very difficult to get in there for that reason.
Well, thank you for explaining that. That's sort of this very selective process going on.
Right, very Darwinian.
So you walk into the lab, and there it is, 1970. The telephone rings at 5 o'clock in the morning. Julie Axelrod. I don't know whether it was at that time in the 1970 they called people early in the morning, but he wins the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology for his contributions.
Right.
Incidentally, he shares it with Sir Bernard Katz, who was my teacher at University College London. So it's a kind of a much interesting story. But so tell us about how was it? How was the atmosphere like?
Julie it was very interesting. First thing he did was, or what he did every year, was when the new fellows came would be July 1. And Julie would go on vacation on July 1 for 3 weeks. And you would get there and you go, well, what am I going to do? Julie isn't here. I can't talk to him. And that was very strategic, because then you'd have to go meet with all the other fellows, figure out what's going on in the laboratory, kind of pair up with somebody to get involved in a project. And by the time Julie got back, all the angst about, what do I do? That was gone, and you were already sort of immersed in the laboratory. And Julie at that time was, it was relatively free with regard to what you could pursue in the laboratory, as long as it was, consistent with his interest in biogenic amines. And so what I asked him if I could do was to study the development of catecholaminergic neurons in the brain. And there was absolutely nothing in the literature about neurotransmitter development in the brain. None. Nada. And so he thought it was a pretty neat project, and that's what I did over the 3 years.
So you had worked with dopamine with Sal Snyder earlier on, right?
We did. We did. We did a science paper describing the dopamine transporter and demonstrating it was different than transporters for norepinephrine, serotonin. Did a lot of work around dopamine and phetamine, how they.
So I wanted to interject something here that I think would be interesting to Dr. Carol Eisenberg as well, because I know Leon's history. That I was reading about Julie Axelrod, that he had applied to medical schools. He was a graduate of the City College of New York, and he had applied to many medical schools. He was a great student, did not get in because he was Jewish.
Right, there was a quota.
And the same thing happened to Leon, of course, at the University of Pennsylvania, but his father wrote to the dean, and the rest is history. But then, so Julie Axelrod then went on to do a master's degree at night, and then become a biochemist, and then he's actually the inventor of acetaminophen, right?
Right,
Tylenol,
that is correct.
Before he came to NIH. So it was an amazing story. Then he had an eye patch also.
Yes, there was
from the pictures.
Bottle of acid he was getting broke and basically.
And he wore an eye patch and
he'd wear glasses with.
Oh, glasses with a
a patch on it. But Julie was, not a speck of bitterness in him at all. And actually, a lot of people say the best decision the medical schools made was not taking him, because now he could do all the great science instead of being primary care physician in the Bronx.
And he was a very outspoken person, because I read an interview, maybe I spoken in a good way and maybe a
Right.
funny way, because they asked him, after he won the prize, because of his predictions about medications and psychiatric medications, and whether Freud was dead. And he said, well, if you're interested in psychotherapy, Freud is not dead.
Yeah.
But he was referring to a new phase that was beginning because people anticipated that these would lead to formation of drugs and psychiatric medications for patients. So it was he knew that what the impact that he was making. Yeah.
Yes. Oh no. I mean, as any genius would be,
Yeah.
he's a complicated individual.
Right.
He was on one hand extremely competitive scientifically. He would say, you got to be there firstest with the mostest, and at the same time, he was very generous, kind, a great mentor.
That's great. So, I mean, I want to sort of, for those young people listening to this interview at the Academy or elsewhere, and might want to know that you then published 12 papers in the Axelrod period, or those 3 years, of which 7 of them are with the Nobel Prize winning scientists.
Right.
And you already published Lasker Award winning scientist. So you're sort of when you look at your CV, you start off with this explosion of papers with this amazing impact. So congratulations. I mean,
Thank you.
It's incredible. So then you returned back to Hopkins to do training in psychiatry.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit about the transition.
So I came back to do a residency in general psychiatry, and that was the time between when I went to NIH and when I came back was the time that the leadership in psychiatry thought that psychiatry was so different from medicine that internships were no longer required. So I come back and I have a cohort of trainees in my class, most of them who'd never seen a person die, take care of people, on their own that are seriously ill, and so it was a little weird. So for me, I could do what I needed to do pretty efficiently, and the reason I came back to Hopkins was that they guaranteed me a faculty position in my second year of residency.
Right.
I actually know
You're probably the only person in the world that had
Yes,
an assistant
amazing.
professor of pharmacology at the same time as
Right. I negotiated that. The other possibility was going to Harvard with Seymour, and when I broached this with Seymour, he go, "Wait, we don't do that at Harvard." And so it ended up it was a no-brainer. I could join the faculty in my second year of residency, start my laboratory, and in my third year of residency, I got my first R01.
Yeah.
And site visited by Floyd Bloom to make sure I was for real.
What was the first R01 about?
The first R01 was this, and again, science is just such a shaggy dog story. So
That's an NIMH grant.
Yes. So
which is a project grant.
right. So the grant was about studying the development of the dopamine neurons in the retina, using the cultured retina as a model for the developing brain, but a much simpler system. And and so I'm doing this for about a year, and we limbed out all the developmental issues. Robbie Schwartz, my first postdoc, and I come on this literature about glutamate being toxic to neurons, and I thought, well, gee, in the retina, John Olney, a psychiatrist from Washington University, showed that if you give high doses of glutamate to newborn rats and mice, it knocks out the neurons in the retina, and it knocks out the neurons in their hypothalamus. And and so doing it that way, you're really constricted by development and so down the hall, Mike Kuhauer was working on getting a ligand to label glutamate receptors. So something was very, very potent at glutamate receptors called canic acid. And so I said to Robbie, let's forget the retinal. This is serious. Let's inject canic acid in the striatum. And we did that, and it killed all the neurons in the striatum, but didn't damage the dopaminergic inputs, did not damage the axons going through. It recreated the pathology of Huntington's disease right there. And
it's a paper published in Science, right?
That was Nature.
Nature, right.
And it was the birth of excitotoxin lesions, which is it's kind of like being Xerox. It was used so frequently they never cited the original source. After about 5 years, but it has been and continues to be the major strategy for selectively lesioning neurons in the brain. Anyway, so I abandoned the retina and got another NIH grant to study development of other neurotransmitter systems in the brain. So I continued on the developmental trajectory for a number of years.
So you are doing your residency, and then you are also doing your research, and this is a period that goes up till 76, right? And there is a change of the guard at the psychiatry department at Hopkins. Mm-hmm. You have a new figure that emerges in American psychiatry. You want to tell us a little bit about that introduction? Because I'm talking about Paul McHugh.
Right.
Yes.
Well, again, it was interesting because it was a horse race between Ross Baldessarini and Paul McHugh.
Yeah.
And there were a substantial number of us. Ross was my supervisor when I did my psychiatry rotation as a medical student.
Was Ross also at Hopkins?
Yeah.
Oh, you see, that's incredible.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Ross was there. He'd done his residency there. He was on the faculty. So he was my supervisor. And, of course, he was very bright and interested in neurobiology of disorders, psychopharmacology. Anyway, so he came down and interviewed, and there was a whole group of us that were very enthusiastic about having young Ross Baldessarini come. And it turns out McHugh was very good friends with several members of the search committee, and
Got it.
and the rest is history.
Anyone who knows Ross, of course, knows what a great mentor he is in terms of his capacity to engage young people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Paul did some, I think, some important things in terms of continuing the legacy of empirical and phenomenologic approaches to psychiatry, and I think he had a very structured educational program that's rigorous, and so I think that's been an important contribution. So the interesting thing, when he came, the way the residency was structured was in the first year was your heaviest commitment to the emergency room. And the second year was a little lighter, and in your last year of residency, you were the consultant to the emergency room and only came in if it was Third World War III. So McHugh gets in there my last year, and he said, "This is crazy. You shouldn't have the most inexperienced people in the emergency room. You should have the most experienced people in the emergency room." So the third-year residents now will spend all their time. So there I was at Christmas Eve thinking, oh, my God, in the emergency room. But I think that was the right decision.
And so you're promoted to assistant professor of psychiatry as well as pharmacology when you finish.
Yes.
And you very quickly move on to associate professor in the departments.
Right.
So you're doing research, but you're also teaching, or what's
I
happening?
had a major role in teaching pharmacology.
Yeah.
I gave you the lectures on movement disorders, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and ran a lab. I mean, a teaching lab. And then about 5 years in, the Department of Neuroscience was created. So I was.
And then you become a professor of neuroscience as well.
Yeah, so in 80, I was
80.
So 75 was made assistant professor, 78 was associate professor, and 80 was a professor.
So that's very fast movement, and so Hopkins shows tremendous flexibility. I mean, in terms, was it just for you or for others as well, or I mean, it seemed
Well,
like
Sal was obviously moved very rapidly up the academic ladder too.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to now what essentially connects you with the sort of the royalty of child psychiatry, and one of the reasons why I think that people should know about is the fact that you were then elected as the director of the child psychiatry unit in 1982. Right. That's the time that the Hopkins moves into the Phipps building. There's a new building that opens up, and so you are the director. How did that happen? Why were you? Because you mentioned that you didn't have a training in, and I also remember that you want to tell us a little bit about Jim Harris, because Jim Harris was around, and he had been the interim director for a while.
So it came to pass that the head of the MD PhD program came to me and said, "I'm stepping down, and I'd like to have you become the head of the MD PhD program." At the same time, Paul McHugh came to me, literally at the same time, and said, we've been searching for a chair of child psychiatry here for a number of years and haven't been successful in attracting anyone. Given your interest in developmental neurobiology and your background in pediatrics, would you consider doing it? And I spent a long weekend fretting because it was a major fork in the road.
Yeah.
I mean, you go down one way and you'd be pretty much cutting yourself off from the clinical aspects of medicine, doing all basic research and administration. Go down the other way, what struck me is you could do something totally revolutionary in child psychiatry. Because, I had thought about doing a residency, and not to be unkind, I didn't see, since Leon had gone, I didn't see a program out there that was really going to teach me what I thought was important. So, and I had small kids, and had a laboratory set up, so it wasn't really realistic. But I thought maybe, with a vision, we could have some real impact on this field, which I think is extraordinarily important. I think is the epicenter of psychiatry, and so I decided that I would accept Paul McHugh's offer and take on the division of child psychiatry. We already had it was pretty small then.
Mm-hmm. How many fellows did you have in each year at that time?
Well, I think we had 2 or 3 fellows. They're mostly FMGs. There was one small inpatient unit, and Jim Harris was there, kind of holding things together.
Yeah, he was. I noticed that he was regarded as your training director, right?
Yeah.
So this was an incredible combo.
Right. So I got Rutter's textbook in child psychiatry, and the dean says, we're going to go up to New York and raise some money. So I said, great. So I get on the train, and I'm reading Rutter's textbook, and he says, what are you doing? And I said, well, if I'm going to be the head of child psychiatry, I got to know what's going on. And so he was able to raise, $500,000, which back then was a lot of dollars. And so in short order, we were able to build a completely new inpatient unit with 13 beds, designed by Jim Harris. And then I think 2 years later, we built another 13-bed inpatient unit for adolescents. We expanded our programs in the Kennedy Institute for Developmental Disabilities. We expanded our residency to 5 and 5 each year. Recruited some,
which is huge at that time.
Yeah. Recruited some, but we had the beds to do it.
Right.
Recruited some stars when they were just young pups, like Alan Reese.
Of course.
Was
this also in the Phipps building, the new building?
No. Yeah. So that was the other deal. Was that McHugh really wanted child psychiatry to be over in the Phipps building, and we were focusing on. Got Leon there sitting on my shoulder, focusing on autism and developmental disorders, severe mental illness in kids.
Yep.
And there's a lot of medical comorbidity. And I said, we're in pediatrics. This is where we stay. And so everything was done in the pediatrics building. And
was this your recommendation?
My decision.
Yeah.
And
so your internship in pediatrics was kind of helpful in grounding that view.
Yeah.
But although you already also had an in brain basis.
Yes. But that allowed us to take care of kids with medical comorbidity.
Yeah.
And so, Paramjit Joshi did her training there. She's just past president of the academy.
She's actually currently the president, but she will be past president.
Right. Okay. So president
in the future.
Did her residency, and she focused on mood disorders. Back then, there was still a debate about. Because of a psychoanalytic perspective, about whether kids could actually become depressed. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know. Theoretically, that might be a problem, but practically, kids were trying to hang themselves. And so she immersed herself in looking at mood disorders in kids, carried out an epidemiologic study in Baltimore County.
Who was that? I'm sorry, I missed
Dr.
that.
Paramjit Joshi. She's the president of the American Academy of Child Psychiatry.
And she ultimately, because it's such a prevalent condition, became sort of the child psychiatry's doctor at.
So you were you're the director of the division, and was Jim Harris at the time the training director?
He was a training director.
It goes from 82 to 89, and
but about 3 or 4 years in, I asked him to really focus on his activities in the Kennedy with developmental disorders. And again, psychiatric comorbidity in developmental disorders is huge, totally neglected. And he did this path-breaking work on psychiatric phenotypes in developmental disorders, self-injurious behavior, depression, etc. And Gail Edelson had finished her MGH at the School of Public Health, and she became the training director. What she did until the end, till I left, and then she became the director of the Division of Child Psychiatry at Jefferson.
And also, you mentioned Joe Piven.
Joe Piven did his training with us.
Yeah.
Had never done a lick of research in his life.
Yep.
I'll never forget it. Joe's such a dear guy. He comes into my office in the second year, and he said, I think I want to do research. What do I do?
What book do I read?
And so we had Susan Folstein in the division who did the first twin study with Michael Rudder on autism.
Right.
And I said,
1967.
Yes, I said, I think autism is incredibly underappreciated. Genetics is important here. I think you go to Susan and look what's happened.
You know what? You might be interested to know this, Joe, but maybe you do know already. But Mike Rudder told us that he was told by Aubrey Lewis, who was then the director of the Maudsley, to not to do child psychiatric training because it was so bad.
Right. I didn't know that.
Yes. And so he sent him instead for a year sabbatical to when he was a junior faculty person to New York, where Stella Chess and
Yes, Stella.
Thomas, and also that's when he took a side trip to Baltimore to meet Leon Eisenberg, and of course he changed the face of child psychiatry as we know it. So so you kind of learned child psychiatry through immersion and teacher
Right.
as a teacher.
I
which
had,
I think is incredible.
and I was an attending on the wards and
Right.
had built up my own practice of severely mentally ill kids, primarily autism, Asperger's, but it was kind of heretical what Paul McHugh did, and I did, and there were a lot of people that in child psychiatry that didn't like it, but there were people.
Well, tell us a little bit about that. I was going to ask you that because I mean, obviously, Paul McHugh is calling the right shots here in some ways, because, but also tell us a little about what the academy and what the mainstream circle, because we know that this is also a very early period, because when Leon comes to MGH in 1967, and then he goes to this psychiatric directors meeting, he stands up and then he talks about, more time for empirical and science,
Right.
and people, and then it says, how do we do that? And also take down some of the supervision that you have in psychotherapy. And of course, that's partially misinterpreted, although
Right.
many people agree with him. But that was the transformational step. And so this is a very, this is a kind of very early period. So I'm curious about how people were thinking.
Well, yeah, I don't want to, get into personalities, except, it struck me that Stanford, where Roland Cirinello, who was trained in child psychiatry, but did a postdoc with Julie when I was there, he became the head of child psychiatry at Stanford.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he died at a young age.
Yeah, he was great.
Yeah,
doing incredible research.
and then of course there was Yale, where Cohen was sort of ambivalent about science and psychoanalysis.
That's Donald Cohen.
Yeah, Donald Cohen. But nevertheless, there was some really good science going on there.
Sure.
That was about it.
And then there was Campbell, Dennis Campbell.
Yeah, Dennis
Denny
Campbell.
and UCLA, right?
Right.
He was doing some work
Right.
with the children with deaf and speech impaired.
And also
and ADHD.
WashU had a.
Right, WashU.
But that was about it. But I would say that like Ludwig Szymanski
Yep.
puts his arm around me, and we can break bread together. We're interested in the same thing.
That's so nice to know. I was going to invite Ludwig today, but he had been traveling, so.
Yeah, and there were several leaders in the field which thought it was fine and felt it was that this would drive the field to get.
And so you were
more
also
involved in research.
relatively quite young, comparably, I'm sure, because given your ascending rank over such a short period of time.
38.
Yeah, well, still.
Baby.
So you continue.
38 sounds good.
So you continue your interests, and I begin also to see actually in your CV that you're beginning to publish things, co-publish things also with people in developmental
Yes.
psychiatry, child psychiatry, autism, and so on. So you're moving into that field for the first time, moving.
Well,
from
yeah,
Huntington's
I got
and
more
Alzheimer's
I got
and-
more clinical.
Yeah, more
I
clinical.
mean, I had this, almost 10 years of doing very basic developmental neuroscience.
Right.
and then this gave me an opportunity to say, how can we tie this into what's going on clinically?
So, well, now I think in the interest of time, we're going to move to quickly
Right.
from this period of child psychiatry that's really emerging. You're contributing, which I think many people don't know, to so many leaders, young leaders in research in, as we know it, in child psychiatry. And you mentioned Alan Rees, John Piven, Susan Folstein, Joshi.
Becky Lander.
Yeah.
She's not a child psychiatrist,
Right.
but did
You mentioned the deputy director of the NIMH, also the...
Marilyn Powell.
Yeah, right. So this is incredible, and it's a really, and then you're expanding the division. You're really contributing a lot. You're not elected into the Institute of Medicine in '90, and then suddenly the bell rings, and this is like the Harvard bell, and we're dying to know what happened. You know, how did you decide to make the move to come to Boston? And does Leon have anything to do with that, or not?
So I had been contacted by Dean Tostison in the late '80s to look at McLean and MGH, and I'm honored to do that. Come up and but. What I knew from our medical students was that Harvard psychiatry was a little bit of a den of vipers, that people would come up to interview and they'd go to MGH and would be told, you don't want to go to McLean, that's a bad place, or they'd interview at the Brigham and hear back, and there was all this infighting that became apparent in terms of recruiting residents, which suggested to me that if this may sound grandiose, but if Harvard psychiatry was going to achieve the level of greatness that it should have, that it should be academically unified. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So finally, Tostison came back to me and he said, look, I can get most of the departments to sign on right now. And I said, well, if I do my job right, then the rest of them will sign on. So I'll take that. I'll take that risk. And at the same time, I was feeling kind of frustrated at Hopkins because I sort of didn't see a way forward for myself, and maybe that was wrong. But anyway, there was two issues there, and I ultimately took Dean Tostison's invitation up.
So this actually sounds like a very noble wish, because I know you mentioned about the infighting, and there were the Sher Frazier debacle with the plagiarism allegations and at McLean, and I was wondering, but you mentioned about the fact that the residents, the prospective residents came and they were given this mixed message, and that you had this incredible crop of people interested to come to Harvard, and there was this kind of a very anomalous problem, yeah, and we know what happened after you came. With the combined programs,
right,
and what happened in terms of the quality of the crop of fellows that came through. And I think history will tell itself in not 10, 15 years from now as to what happened during that period, because it's like the Hopkins child psychiatry, we've had like the best of the best. And so,
right.
so you achieved that goal, but so...
It wasn't easy.
It wasn't easy. I know.
But you may not remember, but the first area I attacked in the positive, was child psychiatry.
Right.
And so when I got up here, we had a retreat. All the academic child psychiatrists, the senior ones, the true academics, to talk about what the field's all about, what we need to do, where it's going, and how we can really make it better. And out of that came the combined program, where we took instead of having senior faculty like Joe Biederman be a circuit preacher riding from program to program to give the same lecture. We put together a series of lectures, and that all the child psychiatry trainees would come together for the academic component, and so they could have the best of our faculty, and then the best of the clinical experiences that could take place at their respective hospitals, and that's still ongoing. So that was, because of my background, because of my interest in child psychiatry, that was the first area I wanted to see if we could really make a difference.
I would like to thank you on the record because
You were there.
I was selected to lead that development and psychopathology course.
Yes,
the
right.
consolidated course at McLean. Then we got to see you every year giving the introductory lecture on neurobiology at McLean, and for us for me also that was a great experience because that's when I engaged more and more Leon to teach. He was free and available, surprisingly, very motivated to come and see the fellows. So this was an incredible educational experience. It's been one of the best educational experiences in the consolidated department, of course, and it still continues under Maria Sauzier.
Right. Yes.
My
yes,
colleague.
Yes. So I sort of emphasize Reagan's 11th commandment. Reagan's 11th commandment was don't speak badly of Republicans, other Republicans, and that's what I would say. To the directors and the chairs of the sub-department. Say anything you want about other people, but don't say anything bad. And when we'd occasionally get feedback from interviews of residents that come through and find a faculty member who was bad-mouthing another program. And
well, you did also a number of other things that I want to touch upon because I was there, I witnessed it, but I wanted to touch upon those. One of them was this Psychiatry Research Committee that you consolidated, and then the Developmental Psychiatry Research Committee, which I thought that was very innovative because it had people like Jerome Kagan in it.
Yep.
Stuart Hauser, Bill Beardsley, and others. And so that was a kind of for me, being part of that was a very interesting experience at Harvard, where this is the first time these people came together. Actually, it was the first time we got to know Jerome Kagan in person. So.
Right. So, again, I when I came here, it became apparent to me that if you wanted an expert in anything, if you looked hard enough, they'd be here at Harvard.
Right.
Except it was all stovepipe. The expert never got out of his office to meet with him or her other colleagues. And that's why the research committee, for example, was a way to get people to really start interacting and thinking interdisciplinary fashion about developmental.
And then you also created this newsletter. I remember where the people essentially had a sense of community. They would feel more connected. Then you created the Harvard Review of Psychiatry, which really became a very important outlet for not only for Harvard-based faculty and fellows and trainees, but nationally and internationally.
Basically,
and again, congratulations. I mean, that has just been a fantastic contributions to the Harvard psychiatry throughout this time. And there were a lot of meetings at the Harvard Faculty Club that we're going to see again next week. And that led people to feel more connected with each other. But there was a problem. I recall that there was a problem in promotional situation with people. There was bottlenecks in many institutions, that this whole process of promotion was being in some ways jeopardized by the perspectives of different, I'm putting it politely, but so can you tell us about some of this insider knowledge about some of that aspects?
Well, it seemed kind of arcane to me, but when I got here, I discovered that there hadn't been a professorial promotion at McLean for a number of years, because technically there wasn't a professor running McLean, and so there was no one to represent McLean. So we had Jonathan Coyle was an associate professor, one of the greatest people, a giant in psychopharmacology, did the first controlled studies on antipsychotics, and he's an associate professor. John Gunderson, who'd done all this, path-breaking work on
Absolutely.
borderline. His promotion had been sitting on the docket for like 6 years. So there were a number of different problems. To me, one of the most striking problems was I think there were 2 women professors. I got a faculty of 1,600, and there's only 2 women professors. So,
And I think one of the first woman professors in psychiatry is one of the first
Yeah.
professors at Harvard Medical School,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of
So,
not making much progress over the years.
right. So the issue was really organizing the whole promotional process, and I became a world-class expert on how to use the promotion system at Harvard. And we had a faculty of 1,600, and I presented every promotion for 10 years, and to the professorial or to the assistant associate professor committee.
Tell us about the support you got from Dean Tosterson, because Dean Tosterson was very important for the medical education at Harvard Medical School at the time then you were recruited, and also his views on very hard-nosed views on integrity in
Yes.
science, integrity in professional integrity among physicians at the Harvard Medical School. So this was an important mission for him.
Well, before I say something about Dean Tosterson, I would like to give a shout out to Dean Ross at Hopkins,
Yeah.
who backed my appointment as the chair of child psychiatry at Hopkins, and really worked hard to raise resources for that academic program.
That's when you were raising the funds too.
Yes.
Yeah.
He and Dean Tosterson, to my mind, were a couple of the best deans in academic medicine. One other thing about Ross is when Nixon came in and there was a tremendous cut in the NIH budget, and there was discussions about maybe we got to get out of research. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out and raise money, and we'll have our own career development awards at Hopkins so that young people can get their scientific careers off the ground and then be competitive in NIH. So that was the type of guy he was. Dan Tosterson, what I really liked about Dan was he was genuinely curious, and he would want to know what was going on scientifically. Where do you see the field going? And I would get together with him for a breakfast about once every 6 months. Mm-hmm. He'd want to know what's going on in the department, and he was very supportive.
Right. So all these resurgence of promotions, mm-hmm. and not just only in one direction of psychiatry, but across a very broad-bound, eclectic interest areas in psychiatry. You mentioned, from Gunderson to others, interested in,
Right. That was one of the thing that used to really annoy me was there was a general perception on the promotion committee that psychiatry was somehow different, that you're different. And so I saw my job as educating them to the fact that we conduct our medical and academic lives just like everybody else does. We have the same standards. We don't require different standards. Now, it may require a little education to them about why studies in epidemiology or psychological aspects of psychiatry are important. But the same issues about academic quality are no different between psychiatry and internal medicine. I saw that as my job, and I think, as much as I succeeded, people were promoted.
Well, this is, this emphasis that you mentioned about psychiatry being part of pediatrics or neurological interface or the brain sciences and so on is so much timely in current times. I know that Mario Maj and Norman Sartorius just edited a fantastic book on comorbidity between psychiatric disorders and medical disorders and so on. People are waking up, and the WHO is talking about this integration. So it's in some ways, I mean, your absence in the scene here is kind of a little bit amiss, but I want to say how much you were ahead of your time, and I think it might have made it easier for you because you already were in it, and so it might made it easier for you to communicate with
Yes.
the leadership in the medical school, particularly people like Daniel Torstenson
Yes.
and others. Okay, well, thank you. But you still continue to publish a lot of papers, which I think continue to keep an active research track. You are editing the Harvard Review of Psychiatry.
Not anymore, no.
Well, no, at that time.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
talking
at
about
that time.
these
Yes,
91, 2001
Right,
period.
yes, excuse me.
You're running around going to all these meetings and breakfasts and all this stuff. How did you do it? I don't know how. It's a tremendous effort, isn't it?
Well, I have to say, 1991 was honest horrendous because I became the chair of psychiatry at Harvard. I became the president of the Society for Neuroscience with about 35,000 members, and I was appointed to NIMH council.
Yes.
So it was a little bit insane, and I apologize to my wife for that.
Well, I remember you calling in some kind of a review as a third discussant in an NIMH training grant review process. I was in the room. And they say Joe Coyle is calling, and he'll think, what the heck is he doing here? And so you were involved in a lot of activities.
Right.
And
Probably a little too much, but
yeah,
it's
but
ancient history now.
it's incredible. And then tell us a little bit about what happens towards the end with the McLean losing money, and you mentioned about McLean Hospital and all these leadership issues.
Each of these hospitals were sui generis in terms of their clinical components, and I was responsible for training and research in 9 hospitals, which ran the gamut from a veterans hospital to a community hospital, Cambridge, to a freestanding psychiatric hospital, McLean, to general hospital psychiatry programs in the Brigham and the BI and the MGH, and a freestanding pediatric hospital with a psychiatry program. But in the mid-90s, managed care came with a vengeance in psychiatry in Massachusetts. And it was devastating for all these programs that had inpatient beds. But McLean clearly was most vulnerable because it had 165 inpatient beds. And it had been basically satirized as a country club, and you can't be, it doesn't take care of you seriously mentally ill. Well, that may have been the McLean in the 50s when there was a 9-hole golf course out there. But in the mid-90s, McLean was schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychotic depression, alcoholism, substance abuse, and Alzheimer's disease. This was like a state hospital used to be in terms of the patients they were covering. And so with managed care, the average length of stay went from about 28 days, which is exactly where it was at Hopkins when I left, so this wasn't some sort of very deviant, to about 11 days. And what that meant was even running in place, you would have to increase your admissions almost threefold. And you're not even running in place because they kept on negotiating down how much they were going to reimburse. So McLean went from being in the black, making a little, not a profit as a nonprofit, but having about $1 million in excess at the end of the year. In 91 to 96, it was the loss was greater than $8 million.
How much?
$8 million.
What is
And it looked as if the hospital might close. They had consultants come in. By this time, McLean was part of, it was
Partners.
part of Partners, and it was a wholly owned subsidiary of Massachusetts General Hospital. They got consultants in that said, well, if you plot this in another 2 years, the average length of stay is going to be 42 minutes, and so this is not a viable. So Steve Mirren, who was the president at that time, had a very difficult task, had to reduce personnel and do a number of things. And at the end of the day, McLean had sort of the winning recipe, because it had all these beds that it could use for residential beds, so it could cut length of stay without compromising health and having people stay in these much less expensive. So anyway.
And they have been a leader since then.
Yes.
In making the transition to these acute residential treatment programs,
Right.
and they have adapted. But it was a period of transition that was very difficult, very stressful.
It was terrible, and it was terrible over Cambridge Hospital when he started reducing uncompensated care reimbursement. So the number of child psychiatry beds have been radically reduced. My calculation, I had more inpatient child psychiatry beds under my control at Hopkins than there were in Los Angeles last year. So you can see how difficult it has been.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to make reference to one more thing that it occurred to me actually. You write a lot of research papers, and of course you're very true to your interest in science, but you've also written some editorial pieces, and what is also very impressive is that the fact that your range of writing always reflects some sense of justice. Maybe it's from the College of Holy Cross, or whether it's the Jesuit schooling. I don't know.
Leon Eisenberg.
But, or Leon Eisenberg.
Well, I mean, you look at
just,
his publications.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's the same thing. And his commitment was exactly the same. But I noticed one paper that, and I'm going to, as an example, I'm going to talk about that. In 2000, the year before you stepped down
Right.
from the consolidated chair, you wrote an article in JAMA on psychotropic drug use in very young children.
Right.
And you describe also a disparity in the data sets that you looked at, with the Medicaid data sets, that many of these kids were actually poor kids that were being medicated.
And minority.
I thought that was just amazing. And you not only stop there, but you then do your little mini survey of the board of the Journal of the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology, where you asked them if they would medicate very young children, and many of them said no.
Right.
And so you wrote this piece. I thought that was just amazing. So tell us a little bit about, I mean, you have this, the ethical compass and this sort of sense of the distributive phenomena of how you treat the field of science, but also in terms of professionally. So I thought that was very commendable, but I just want to hear from you about what you thought about, what was the changes that were happening in psychopharmacology. Here you are in your residency, you are an assistant professor of pharmacology while you're a resident, and now you're writing in 2000 an article about what happens to the the young brain, and so you're talking about that.
Right. So a couple of things come to mind. Number one, again, just recalling my experiences with Leon. Leon was one of the things that really impressed me was he was always running against the grain a little bit. So when back in the 70s, he was writing about the problem with brainless psychiatry, and back in the 90s and 2000, he was talking about the problems with mindless psychiatry. And so, like any area, there are enthusiasms, and they can get beyond where let's say people get ahead of their skis. And I think a second thing that happened was the growing awareness of brain plasticity in the late '90s into the current century. Because when I started out, most of us believed the brain was pretty much hardwired, and there wasn't going to be much changes in adulthood. But with the appreciation of plasticity and the role of experience, then one did have a context for understanding how psychological interventions could work and could be quite powerful if harnessed in a scientific way, evidence-based way. And the third thing that troubled me about what was happening in psychiatry, and this extended to child psychiatry, was the disconnect between psychological interventions, family management, and what the child psychiatrist did. And the child psychiatrist and the psychiatrist simply was relegated to the role of writing prescriptions. Mm-hmm. Well, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, keep parents bring in children with problems. Well, aside from the family therapy you might get from the social worker, maybe I ought to write a prescription for this. And I was really, I was really troubled by that, and I was really troubled by what was becoming increasingly evident, and that is the behavior of poor kids, and particularly minority kids, was being pathologized and a target for pharmacologic intervention. And I think we needed to stand back and ask ourselves, what's going on here?
And you also, in your own personal life, you have, I know that you have, tell me about the adoption. You have a child that is adopted.
Well, our first two children, my first two sons are adopted.
Yeah.
The first, so it was one of those issues where, and this is back when medicine and reproduction is a little more primitive than it is now, but anyway, we wanted to have children, and we weren't having children, so my wife and I got together, and we said, well, there's another way to do it, let's adopt. So the way you did it back then was you just let everybody know you wanted to adopt. And so the first, our oldest son was identified by a tent mate physician of my father from the Second World War, and that's Peter, and he's a dear son. And I had let everybody know at NIH, and one of my colleagues was Vietnamese, and it turned out her sister was the chief of obstetrics in Saigon. Mm-hmm. And like 6 weeks after we got Peter, she said, we have a little boy that is being put up for adoption. And so we said, well, we don't want to have an only child. And so we started working on adopting Andrew, and it took 2 years to get him out, because they didn't want to lose males, because males could be soldiers. And we got him out 8 weeks before the fall of Saigon. So he came over when he was 2, and so we have these two boys that are 6 weeks apart in age, and people say twins. And I'm like, yeah, sort of. And so Andrew now is a emergency medicine physician in the University of Pittsburgh healthcare system.
Fantastic. Congratulations. Yeah. That's such a great story. So this is, I think, you're learning, the commitment to children, child psychiatry through reading on the trip to New York and
right.
Rutter's book, through your own experience raising kids, to educating people, and also particularly helping with the NIH mission, which was a very important task for you. You wrote a lot about NIH funding, making sure that NIMH was on track. You served on the advisory committee of the NIMH during this period. So I think I wanted to ask you sort of in the end some parting comments. I mean, because I know that how do you see the future? I know also that you've done 10 years of editing on the, more than 10 years of editing on the Journal of the Archives of General Psychiatry and also JAMA Psychiatry recently, and you left that post in December 2014, right?
14, right.
So tell us about some views about how you see where the field is going and how you're, just to say that, and I know Carola can attest to that, because you told me that Leon wrote his best papers after he retired or after he, and this is actually true. If you look at Leon's papers, his amazing crop of papers came out after he found a lot of time in the morning commuting to the medical area to write these incredibly influential papers. So how do you see your role, and how do you see our field, and how do we intersect together? Because we don't want to lose you.
Well, I mean, short term, I still love the process of discovery. I still like working with the students and postdocs in the lab. I don't, it's not onerous. It's not like work. It's something I look forward to doing. So I plan to do that a little bit longer. Although Genevieve and I spend a lot more time with each other and traveling, so. But more broadly, it's not just about me. More broadly speaking, I think we're on a very important trajectory of rapidly expanding knowledge, and this is at both fronts. One, much more biologically driven, especially with the Human Genome Project. Now 6 months ago, we got 106 risk genes for 105 risk genes for schizophrenia. We'll have a similar group for bipolar disorder. That's going to give us a lot to chew on and digest, but it certainly tells us a lot more about these disorders. The second thing, I think, because of these genetics, I think the whole DSM thing will be out the window in a decade, because the disorders will be classified basically on risk genes and other.
What do you think of the RDoC, the proposal by Tom Insel's colleagues at NIMH?
I think that DSM right now is still useful for insurance purposes and categorizing people, but I think we delude ourselves if we believe that it's telling us something real. It's not very deep, and I think that with what's going on in genetics and brain imaging, that we will have much more reproducible biologic markers to orient our decisions about treatment, diagnosis and treatment, and we'll be moving towards a very personalized medicine approach. The other point I want to make is with epigenetics, the role of environment is going to become even more robust. I saw last week a paper on quantitative morphology of cortex in children, and children raised in deprived circumstances have clearly less cortical volume. That's environment, and it's a pretty scary aspect. But I think Leon's words will be ringing very true on the importance of social aspects of psychiatry and in medicine, But ultimately, I think they'll be played out in the way the brain works. So I'm not walking away from the brain.
Yeah, right.
But I think that clearly it's much less deterministic than we naively thought about genetics. And it's a lot less ephemeral than we used to think about mind. And that's where the excitement. The final thing I'll say is the really smart kids, I think, are going to be going back into psychiatry because this is where the exciting advances are going to be made.
Well, at the moment, the direction is more into fields that make more money, like dermatology and so on. But I think we're hoping that we will change that again.
Well, yeah, but that's the way it is
Yeah.
right now in general. So, how much of the class at Harvard's going into finance? The good news is a lot of hedge funds are closing, and maybe they'll get back to sort of more challenging intellectual and social pursuits.
One burning question I will ask you, which is about autism. So, what do you think about what's going on in that field in terms of the numbers, in terms of what you think? How do you explain that? And you can answer that question, and then I'm going to summarize, and then we'll end.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so when I was in pediatrics, we'd go out to state hospital and see the occasional rare autistic child. Also, we'd go out to the state hospital and see individuals with Down syndrome who were profoundly retarded, could not do much, couldn't feed themselves, and we were told that's what Down syndrome is all about. So I say that because now I go to the bank on Saturday and I got a troop of about a half a dozen adults with Down syndrome who are living in shelters, working and having a great time in managing their finances. So, that's just a statement about how wrong we can be about opportunity and repair. With regard to autism, as I said, it was considered to be pretty rare, and now it's up to 1%, which is about the prevalence of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. I think those numbers are real. The question is, did it suddenly increase 20-fold over the last 40 years? I don't think so. But I do think that this increase is real. I don't think it's 20-fold, but it may be 50% or more. And as the editor of JAMA Archive Psychiatry, I published several papers showing environmental factors that can increase the risk for autism, in particular SSRIs, exposure to hydrocarbons in terms of air pollution. One of my side interests all along has been in neurotoxicology because I used them as tools. And I can tell you our environment, and this is not sort of a tree-hugging statement, but there are things in our environment that didn't exist 50 years ago, which definitely have impact on the developing nervous system. And these are insecticides and herbicides. And so along with air pollution and SSRIs, which didn't exist 50 years ago, which does disrupt brain development, especially serotonergic neurons, which are implicated in autism. I think there has been, and I think there's good evidence that there's been an absolute increase in the prevalence of the disorder.
Thank you for bringing such clarity to this discussion. First of all, I want to thank you for all your contributions to training in psychiatry, in particular, in our case, child psychiatry, in neuroscience, in young postdoctoral training of scientists at a level that is going to be leadership worldwide. And I think one can very easily say that, your contributions that have intersected so many areas in our field is going to be remembered. This interview, I hope, is just the beginning of trying to appreciate your contributions that you have done, not only at Hopkins and at Harvard teaching, and these have been magnificent institutions, and they already had significant contributions, but I believe, and I do hope, and I certainly personally would make sure that the information is disseminated about the work, and you are a fantastic, deserving awardee of the Leon Eisenberg Award, which is a relatively small award, but it symbolically, I hope, means a lot for us. Actually, the part of your CV that's even more helpful, which we didn't focus on, was the papers and how they go from cyanuric acid to like going into like publishing a case report on, you know, Asperger disorder and bipolar disorder and this kind of thing. And you're trying to help people to put out this information and mentoring people, and of course my own personal experience and has been, you know, terrific. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you.
Well, thank you for...
It wasn't just a trip to the memory lane, it's reviewing the history of child psychiatry, as you did in a magnificent way, and much of it was what Leon really felt all the way through it. But I did like that expression I never heard before of scratching the... You mentioned something, Leon was always for the opposite.
Oh.
What expression did you use, scratching?
You said going against the grain?
Going against the grain. I like that because he was against psychoanalysis when it was popular.
Right.
Then toward the end he became, how come they don't teach the students how to proceed and to do psychotherapy and not just give a pill. He was always in that direction. In some ways, with exception of research, that you continue to do magnificent work. I also wanted to thank you. I'm sorry I'm making it so long, because you appointed me in a committee of two people to see what was happening to women in psychiatry. I just love that. I don't remember whether we wrote a paper. The women are still not doing as well, although we are slowly moving up. Anyway, I could now continue for another hour, and I know these poor people have come thinking they were going to be...
I think the contribution to the promotion of women and what you just told us and is quite remarkable in psychiatry, particularly under
And you also said something that not as many people go to psychiatry, and because of the differential of income. I just want to tell you that this year and the last year somewhat, the number of applicants to psychiatry is increasing rather rapidly, but for the wrong reasons, because they cannot get residencies in other specialties that are overpopulated. So there are so many foreign students, and they are bringing up new medical schools all over the place. So they have an overabundance of people applying. So, you know, psychiatry is gaining ground for the wrong reasons, I think.
But, you know,
anyway, I just feel like giving my opinion.
The issue here is, you know, here we have, you know, Joe, because I mean, you have your lab and you have your postdocs, and they benefit from you, I'm sure, immensely. You know, but there is a lot that you could bring still, and in terms of this, because I think what happened in my analysis of it is that, you know, when people like Tostason and Eisenberg and Ross, you mentioned, you know, you brought through something through science, and they noticed something about the way you are, your integrity and your sense of how you do science. And I think they pushed that formula, and you benefited a lot of people through that process. And but you haven't come out to sort of write kind of this very much more open sort of a I would love to see that, because, you know, when I see some of the papers that you wrote, some of the position papers that you wrote, they're amazingly eloquent and very influential, and I think But you don't do as much commentary, even with the archives.
Yeah, I did a few.
You
yeah,
do more
but,
science, less commentary.
Well, there's a lot of hidden commentary there because I
Yeah.
invite people to write commentary and you end up ghost writing it.
Oh yeah, ghostwriting. You see, you don't. You're. This is like you're one of the hidden gems, and this is what amazes me. Is because you are sort of the understated person in the field. And if one can look at what you have done in child psychiatry and psychiatry at Harvard, and also child psychiatry at Harvard, it's just amazing. I think that we talk about Leon, and there are many other, and you know, the league is really very hard when you have Leon in the league, but you know, you are definitely up there in terms of what you've done, and people haven't. They need to understand that. So I'm very, very privileged to speak to you about this.
Thank you. That was
It has
a
been
great
a
interview.
real
Thank you.
treat.
Thanks
It
very
has
much.
been a real treat.